Mr. President, I'd like to ask this body for just a moment to remember something that there are probably many people that have never heard of the first time. Because for whatever reason, a bit of America's past seemed to just disappear from memory as soon as it occurred. So let me take us back almost 100 years for a moment. In the summer of 1919, that summer was commonly referred to after the fact, the Red Summer. The Red Summer included race riots all over America. White on black riots specifically. There were white individuals moving into black neighborhoods and devastating those communities. It happened in Charleston, South Carolina, happened in Longview, Texas, happened in Bisbee, Arizona, happened in Norfolk, Virginia, happened in Chicago, happened in Washington, D.C., happened in Elaine, Arkansas, Knoxville, Tennessee, Omaha, Nebraska, and many others. Scattered around the country, one after another, month after month, these race riots moved. As World War I veterans, at that time called the Great War, as those veterans returned home, many looking for jobs, and the anxiety that rose up from that, as many black Americans that had bravely fought in World War I pursued jobs and were unable to get them or were hated by whites because some of these black individuals came home and took some of the jobs that, quote unquote, they were entitled to, the tension began to rise across the country. And it burst out into riots. I would tell you, Oklahoma was mostly spared from that in 1919 and 1920. But May the 30th of 1921, a young man named Dick Rowland, who worked downtown, African-American gentleman, was 19 years old. He was actually shining shoes in downtown Tulsa, which if you've ever been to Tulsa, and if you've missed it, if you've never been there, you need to go. It's an absolutely beautiful town. And if you can ever see the pictures of what Tulsa looked like in the 1920s, you'd be astounded. It was an oil boom town. Oil was discovered all around Tulsa, and people came from all over the country. Most of those as individuals around Tulsa that put in oil wells and suddenly became rich. And Tulsa became a wealthy community extremely rapidly. And the architecture and history of it is beautiful. But like every other town in Oklahoma in the 1920s, it was also segregated by law. The northern district of Tulsa at that time was called the Greenwood District, just north of downtown. It was an incredibly prosperous community. In fact, African Americans from around the country moved to Tulsa because there were doctors and lawyers and businesses, grocery stores, department stores. It became a very wealthy community because some individuals lived in Greenwood and worked in Tulsa, which was a fast-growing, wealthy city. And then also there was great freedom within the Greenwood District. And oddly enough, the segregation that was required in Oklahoma at the time also caused Greenwood to grow because many African Americans could not buy groceries or couldn't go to certain restaurants or go into certain businesses or department stores into Tulsa. And so when those businesses opened up in Greenwood and the population continued to grow, it became a fast-growing city as well. In fact, it was nicknamed the Black Wall Street of America. That community of extremely well-educated, many World War I veterans that had come home, many business and entrepreneurs became known as a place where blacks could come from around the country, start businesses, grow businesses, and grow into prosperity. I'd love to be able to show you all the homes and the places of what that looked like in the 1920s. It's a beautiful district. But getting back to my story on Dick Rowland, working downtown in Tulsa, most buildings in Tulsa downtown wouldn't allow a black man to go to the bathroom there, but the Drexel building would. And so he would go to the Drexel building to be able to go to the restroom. He would get on the elevator because the restroom that he was allowed to use was up in an upper floor. And that particular day on May the 30th, 1921, he got into the elevator, and the elevator operator was a 17-year-old young lady, white lady, named Sarah Page. Now, the elevator doors closed, and as they got to the upper floor, They got off, and at that point, Sarah Page screamed. To this day, we don't know why. We don't know if there was an altercation. We don't know if Dick Rowland bumped her and she screamed. We don't know if she was just scared. We don't know why. But a friend heard her scream and came running and saw Dick Rowland stepping out of the elevator, and accusations started immediately. And within 24 hours, the police arrested Dick Rowland and took him into the courthouse, into the jail in downtown Tulsa. By the time the afternoon paper had been released on the 31st of May, 1921, the word was out that a young African-American male had raped a white female in the elevator at the Drexel building. And a mob began to form outside of the courthouse. That mob gathered around. It started out with around 100, they say, and then quickly grew to 200. The sheriff there in Tulsa, understanding the threat there of this mob gathering around the building, calling for Dick Rowland to be delivered to the mob, immediately turned off the elevator in the courthouse building and put up armed guards in every staircase around that building to not allow any of the people from the mob to get into the building and to try to get upstairs and to be able to get Dick Rowland out. But the mob continued to grow outside that building. Now approaching over 1,000, they understand, by the end of that day. Well, the men that lived in the Greenwood district, not far away from there at all, heard the mob was gathering. Many of them, as I'd mentioned before, World War I veterans. They loaded up with their weapons. They went down to the courthouse to offer their assistance to the sheriff to be an additional armed guard there. The sheriff denied it and said they had the situation well in hand, turned the men away. As the mob continued to grow and continued to press the sheriff, the men returned back and said, "You need our help here. We do not want a lynch mob in our city. We've all heard what had happened in other cities just a year ago. We don't want that happening here." The sheriff again turned them away and said, "You're not needed here. We have the situation at hand." But as the men left that second time, some white men in the crowd confronted some of the African-American men as they left. And there was a struggle as one of the white men tried to take away the guns from the African-American men, and a shot was fired. And the rest of it was chaos. Many of the African-American men headed back to the Greenwood district as quick as they could, as that mob turned into a riot. They pursued them back to the Greenwood district of Tulsa, not far away, literally just on the other side of the tracks from downtown Tulsa. Pursued them back into the Greenwood district and started a massive riot the evening of the 31st of May. The police, trying to quell this massive riot that broke out, immediately deputized many white men that were gathered around downtown Tulsa, gave them weapons, and told them to go arrest as many black people as they could to stop the riot. And they ran into the Greenwood district, and shootings began all over the Greenwood area. Many, the numbers are up over the thousands, of African-American men were arrested, dragged back into Tulsa, and were put in temporary detention facilities there and held, which left the Greenwood district completely unprotected. Looters and rioters moved through that part of Tulsa all throughout the night and into the next morning, literally looting every home, looting every business, doctor's office, grocery store, department store, looting each one of them and then burning them to the ground. By the time the National Guard arrived the next day to stop the riot, almost every building, home, business, everything in a 1 mile square that was the Greenwood district before was completely destroyed. So it makes you wonder what happened then. Over 300 people, is estimated, died that night in Tulsa. No one was ever charged with a crime. Dick Rowland, that I mentioned before, was released from jail because no charges were ever pressed on him. Sarah Page never pressed charges against him. Insurance companies refused to pay the African American businesses that were burned to the ground. They walked away. What happened next is even more surprising to me. I'm not surprised that many African American individuals that lived in the Greenwood district left. I don't blame them. But most everyone stayed. They literally rebuilt their homes by living in tents for a year. The American Red Cross moved in and helped build wood platforms where there used to be homes so that tents could be built in that spot and people could live there while they rebuilt their own home and rebuilt their own businesses. And one by one, they rebuilt. Mount Zion Baptist Church, that had just been finished a few months before, that had a $50,000 mortgage on it, no one walked away from that church. They rebuilt that church and they repaid the $50,000 mortgage that was owed from before. And block by block, individuals started rebuilding Greenwood. But by the 1940s and all the struggles that had happened, it never fully recovered to what it ever was before. And what's also fascinating about it is the state of Oklahoma quietly ignored what happened that day. Most folks growing up in Oklahoma have never even heard of the Tulsa Race Riot. The Tulsa Race Riot, in many ways, is kind of like that uncle that you know that's in your family that ended up in jail, that at Christmas no one ever talks about. Everyone kind of knows they're out there, but you never discuss. That was the Tulsa Race Riot for Oklahomans for a very long time. Until just a couple of decades ago, the conversation quietly started again about a very difficult part of our history. 95 years ago, this week, the worst race riot in American history broke out in Tulsa, Oklahoma. And in 5 years, the entire country will pause and will look at Oklahoma and will ask a very good question. What's changed in 100 years? What have we learned in 100 years? I would say a few things. I would say we can remember. There's great honor to be able to say to people we have not forgotten about what happened. We've not ignored it. We've not swept it under the rug and pretended it never happened. We remember. I think there's great honor in that. We can recognize that there is more to be done. That we can't just say, you know what, that was then, this is now. There is more to be done. Our own racial challenges, what have happened in many parts of the country just over the past few years, reminds us again, we don't have legal segregation anymore, but we still have our own challenges as a nation. We still need to have a place in a nation where every person of every background has every opportunity. It's right for us. We can respect the men and women who lived, worked, died, and rebuilt, and pour respect on those individuals that are still working to rebuild. People like Donna Jackson, who's leading a group that she calls the Tulsa 100. To say by the time we get to the 100-year anniversary, just 5 years from now, there will be 100 new businesses in the Greenwood area. The jewel of Black Wall Street was the number of businesses and entrepreneurs and family businesses that were there. And Donna Jackson and a group that's around her, of business leaders, of church leaders, of individuals from the area, family members, and some of them even connected to survivors of the riot itself. All are committed to what can we do to reestablish the business community again in Greenwood and in North Tulsa. Not looking just for black businesses, business period, to re-engage a community that's still scarred years later. To be able to have some respect for those folks that run the Greenwood Cultural Center, Reconciliation Park, and the individuals that are willing to be able to talk about it in a way that's open and honest, not accusatory. But my fourth R, after remember, recognize, and respect, and that's reconciliation. What are we going to do as a nation to make sure that we're reconciled? Now, this simple speech on this floor is not going to reconcile our nation. And we have for years said this is something we need to talk about. Well, quite frankly, we do need to talk about it, but we also need to do something about it. What can we do to make sure that our children do not grow up in a nation that forgets their past, but also make sure it's not repeated again? to make sure all individuals are recognized and respected, and that every person has the same opportunity. There's no simple answer to all this, but I bring to this body a story that I think is important for us to talk about. The worst race riot in American history, in my state, and in all of our states. And I bring to us a question. 5 years from now, we as a nation will talk about this even more when it's the 100-year anniversary. Who are we as a nation? How far have we come? And what do we have left to go to make sure that we really are one nation under God, indivisible? With that, Mr. President, I yield back.